Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and to be back in this area, because one of the things I also do is I'm actually one of the canon theologians of the Diocese of Leeds. So some of you will have seen me in that incarnation, which is one of the reasons we decided to talk about, that I would talk about today, not about the Reformation and its implications for the English Reformation, which I have done on several occasions in this area, and some of you may have heard me talk about that in the past. But we chose this title, The Reformation and Brexit, History and the Position of the UK in Europe. And when we were fixing that, which this date was fixed about 2 years ago, and the title was fixed at some point early last year. So I kind of thought it would all be wound up by now, but there you go. That was wishful thinking, was it not? So what we're going to do is to think about how Reformation history has been used in the Brexit debates and what that tells us about Reformation history, but also I'm going to do a bit of thinking with you about whether that's an accurate understanding of history or not, and also just to see how some of these things actually played out in the referendum itself. So let's start with Ian Martin, who wrote back in 2012, an article in the Daily Telegraph, which is no longer available online. I don't know if they became so ashamed of it that they took it down, or they simply don't archive this column for very long, asking as a headline, so this is 2012, why is the Church of England speaking up for the EU? And you can see lurking at the bottom there are the Archbishops of York and Canterbury. And in it, he said, the Act of Supremacy stipulated that England and then Britain did not genuflect to any foreign authority. Now, I read this around about 2012 because I was asked to give a paper in 2013 looking at Europe and the churches, and this was in a series on Europe and the churches in Frankfurt, and they asked me to speak about England and Europe, or the Church of England and Europe. So I sort of waved my hand and said, excuse me, I live in Scotland, so perhaps we could just make this the Church of England and the Church of Scotland. But I was therefore looking for questions in 2012, 2013 around this question of the churches and the position in Europe. So I was very struck as a Reformation historian by Ian Martin's claim that the Act of Supremacy was 1534, Henry VIII's decision that the Church of England would no longer be under the Church of Rome, is somehow some kind of precursor for what the process we're going through at the moment. Unfortunately, at the time, I didn't make a note of any more of Ian Martin's text than that, which was idiotic. I should have copied the whole thing, I think, because it was more in the same vein. But if you actually Google, and this was a Google search from last year, Reformation and Brexit, you actually find that this is not a singular text. Giles Fraser, writing in The Guardian in May 2016, wrote, Brexit recycles the defiant spirit of the Reformation. And he goes on to say, on the 31st of October 1517, the big anniversary we were keeping last year, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of All Saints Wittenberg, targeting corruption at the highest levels of the Church. The scandal of which he complained was the sale of forgiveness to finance an ecclesiastical gravy train and lavish building projects such as that of St. Peter's in Rome. From here, the Reformation would spread out to become an across-the-board protest at the elitist and centralising philosophy of the Roman Church. Here, he says, we find the intellectual roots of Euroscepticism. So this is Giles Fraser, the philosopher and theologian, writing in The Guardian in the opinion column in May of 2016. And what he's doing here is drawing on academic research by Margarete Scherer, a German sociologist, who in a survey of of European churches and their understanding of their relationship to Europe, came to the conclusion that there is a considerably higher prevalence of Euroscepticism in traditional Protestant churches, in traditionally Protestant countries, than in traditionally Roman Catholic countries. And she relates that, as we'll see a bit later, to an understanding that Protestant churches are more likely to be national churches. Giles Fraser took from that a consequence. Giles Fraser is quite a Brexit campaigner at that stage. The EU, he says, still feels like some semi-secular echo of the Holy Roman Empire. It's interesting here because what he's doing here is eliding the Holy Roman Empire and the Roman Catholic Church. So the Reformation, which he's just said is against the centralising tendencies of the Church, he's now saying is against the Holy Roman Empire. Well, that's arguably also true. But here we have the Holy Roman Empire being symbolising the EU. The Holy Roman Empire, a bureaucratic monster that through the imposition of canon law, which of course the Holy Roman Empire never did because it was a secular empire, it wasn't a church empire, swallows up difference and seeks after doctrinal uniformity. This, he says, was precisely the sort of centralisation that Luther challenged, and resistance to it is deep in the Protestant consciousness. Now tell that to the Germans. But here is Giles Fraser saying Protestantism and the EU, Protestantism and resistance to the EU are some kind of genetically connected pieces. Now, Dermot McCulloch, in a spirited response to Giles Fraser, wrote, "How wrong can you be, Giles?" They're good friends, it should be said, about both the English Reformation and the wider movement across Europe. After its first explosion in northern Germany in 1517, the European Reformation, says McCulloch, was a completely international movement, transcending and breaking down local boundaries. So that's May 2016 as well. So, he says, it's the Remain camp which represents the European and the British Reformations, not the Brexiteers. You can see historians were getting really into this in 2016. Remainers are the people who resist breaking the natural wider ties in our continent. True, they know the system needs radical reform, and that was the starting point for many Protestants attacking the old church, including Luther himself. But once the corruption and the mistakes have been remedied, the prospect then, as now, is to look at a new continent-wide unity, not a model of division and weakness. Now, I am not presuming to know what any of you think about Brexit. What I'm interested in is this paper is looking at how these two very different understandings of history actually arise, and what they tell us about how we think about the place of the UK, of the British Isles, in historically, and the place of the Reformation historically in the context of wider European development. And that's what I'm interested in this paper. I'm not going to get in this paper. This is not about trying to persuade anybody anything about Brexit. What I'm interested in is how these questions of relatedness or unrelatedness play out in the historical context. It continued. Last year, of course, we had the Reformation anniversary, and this discussion continued with another article in The Guardian by Martin Kettle, who argues that the deeper legacy of the English Reformation was a tradition of English exceptionalism, which, after the Acts of Union in 1707, dressed itself afresh in Britishness. In this tradition, he says, England or Britain was different, separate, better, blessed, and free from the rules that constrained others. It defined itself over and against Rome and against ultramontane ideas of every kind. And that legacy, he says, has certainly not disappeared. So Kettle's arguing, and I think he's right, that there is a history of how Britain has conceived itself in the European landscape, which has helped to play into where we find and how we think about ourselves today. And it's that history that I'm really interested in. And Kettle goes on to say, just at the point when many of the habits and manifestations of English Protestantism have continued to slip gently towards an ecumenical, multicultural oblivion, which slightly makes me gulp as an ecumenist, but never mind, Henry VIII's legacy has summoned itself for one final and contrarian outburst of the exceptionalist tradition. It has dumped us with Brexit. Again, you can see Kettle's position here. Well, I'm interested in this idea of how we get to English exceptionalism. Now, coming back to Margareta Scherer, one of the arguments that she is offering in her paper, which I have to, as a church historian, reading a sociologist's paper, I'm going to come back later to some of the problematic assumptions that she makes. She suggests that the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and the national project fit naturally together. And that's quite right. National identity and religious identity become very closely entwined in the Reformation. And certainly part of what we're doing and engaging with in the current moment is how nations think of themselves, both as nations and as in connection to other nations. And she also wants to say that traditional church-state relations shape the political culture of each society in an enduring fashion. And I totally agree with that as well. I think we don't always realise just how much how we conceive ourselves is actually shaped by how churches helped us to conceive ourselves. And she also argues that these nowadays reflect distinctive attitudes towards EU institutions, even for individuals who do not belong to a church or who do not attend church services. And we'll see later on when we look at some of the statistics relating to which groups voted how in the referendum, that is absolutely the case in England, certainly. My problem with Scherer's assumption is that she makes some assumptions about the way that Protestant churches and national identity fit together with national government, which certainly don't hold true for Scotland and which arguably don't hold true for the Netherlands. But nonetheless, I think one of the things that she shows is that if you want to argue for English exceptionalism, what Scherer is saying is, well, actually, in that case, there is also going to be a Norwegian exceptionalism. There's also going to be a Danish exceptionalism. There's also going to be a Belgian exceptionalism. I'm avoiding saying German exceptionalism because one of the things that Germany exemplifies to us is a state which, in this Reformation period, and right up until arguably 1918, was not a unified state. So in Germany, and the other anniversary, of course, we've been keeping is the end of the First World War. Until after the end of the First World War, there was no such thing as a German passport. Germany had been unified in 1870, but there was no passport. You still held a passport depending on whether you came from Bavaria or from Hesse or from Baden-Württemberg or wherever. So Germany, it's very difficult to talk about German exceptionalism because there's a multiplicity of identities. But Scherer shows us, I think, that we need to be careful about assuming that English exceptionalism is exceptional. And actually, what does that mean? How do we perceive ourselves if we think about ourselves as being exceptional, and yet everybody's exceptional? It's a bit like that thing about God loves everybody best. God loves everybody best. So, where does that leave us if we're all exceptional? So, how does some of this play out in the historiography of the Reformation? Christopher Haig wrote a really interesting book about, probably nearly 30 years ago now, which is a bit scary, called The English Reformations. And there's a famous passage in it early on where he talks about the English Reformation in contrast to that which, and this is a real quote from his book, from that which Luther, Calvin and co. were doing on the continent. His argument in English Reformations is that the English Reformation was different. The English Reformation was different from that which was going on the continent. And one of the answers to the question of why we don't sing Ein feste Burg very often in a British context, apart from the fact that most people don't know the tune, is, we did very well today, so that was great, but one of the reasons is that actually the English Reformation was not driven by questions of justification by faith and by theological questions in quite the same way that the German Reformation was. Another reason we tend not to sing Ein feste Burg is because actually our hymn tradition does not stem from the 16th century, when you would have been singing metrical psalms, probably, in the English context, in the 16th and 17th centuries, because the hymn tradition really comes into being in the late 17th century and the 18th century. It's not an accident that a lot of the hymns that we sing that do the theological work of Ein feste Burg are actually Methodist hymns, because that is when the great hymn writing tradition comes into being. There's Reformed hymn writing with Isaac Watts and people, but it is a different Reformation. And I want to make clear, I'm not going to be arguing that our Reformation in the UK is the same as everywhere else. I just want to say everywhere is different. So Christopher Hague wanted to say, actually, the English Reformation is exceptional. It's nothing like that Reformation that was going on the continent. And Dermot McCulloch is very allergic to that response, or to that reflection of thinking about the English Reformation. And if you ever hear Dermot, if you ever get him to come and talk, he's great. If you ever hear Dermot talking about what he expected to find when he set out to write his book on Cranmer, was he expected to be writing a book about an English reformer, and where he expected to be using lots of archives in England. What he actually discovered himself doing was writing a book about a continental reformer, somebody who was deeply rooted into the networks of the Reformation, and he found himself using archives all over the place because Cranmer corresponded with people right across Western Europe. So one of the things that McCulloch wants to say is, and he wrote a famous article called The Myth of the English Reformation about 1995, is the myth, he says, is that it didn't happen. It happened by accident rather than design. It was half-hearted and sought a middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism. And I would want to add to that list of myths, the myth of the English Reformation is it's different from all the other Reformations in a way that is different from how they're all different. The point of issue, he wants to say, is the identity of the Church of England. And theologians of the mid-17th century and the mid-19th century tend, and I quote him here, to emphasize the Catholic continuity of the Church over the break of the Reformation in order to claim that the true representative of the Catholic Church within the borders of England and Wales was not a minority loyal to the Bishop of Rome, but the Church by law established in 1559 and 1662. So part of this is about the claiming in the 17th century and the 19th century of the Church of England as being the true Catholic Church against Catholic recusants. One of the difficulties of living on an island is you can't say to Catholics who you want to not be part of your church, go and live somewhere else. Well, they did say quite often, go and live somewhere else. But in Germany, what happens, if you have a Catholic territory, you expel Protestants. If you have a Protestant territory, you expel Catholics. But they only have to go just down the road. Because 10 miles down the road, you're in a territory with the other faith. In the British context, an island, it's harder to say to people, you've just got to leave. They did do that, and they definitely did that under Mary the First, where a lot of Protestants left, and under Elizabeth, where Catholics do leave or get burned. But the idea that this is the continuing church and that this is the church of the whole nation is really important for the English and for the Scots, as we'll come to see in the 17th century, and then rediscovered by the Anglo-Catholics, particularly in the 19th century. Now, Dermot would want to argue that the result of that is acts of amnesia or censorship about the actual ethos of the Elizabethan and the Jacobean Church, with a result, he would suggest, that we've more or less unconsciously seen that church through a Laudian prism, and central characteristics have become marginalised or ignored. So one of the things that Dermot is pointing to in his work on the 16th century is the role of international networks in supporting the Reformation. And although we've done a considerable amount of work on that, we still, I think, know less than I think we ought to know about how these networks functioned, about who was corresponding with whom. And one of the questions that I found really intriguing, or realised a couple of years ago it was really intriguing, is we know very little about how the English Reformation was being perceived elsewhere. We've done quite a lot of work over the years as historians about how Luther is being received in England or in Scotland. So how the German ideas get to us. And historians continue to be quite puzzled by how to categorise the Reformation under Henry VIII, which is very difficult to categorise because Henry VIII split from Rome, but he didn't introduce an English liturgy. He introduced an English Bible and shut down the convents, but he didn't allow priests to marry. So it's a kind of a Reformation because it splits from Rome, but it doesn't do a lot of the things that other Reformations elsewhere in Europe are doing as part of the normal introduction of the Reformation. And historians have been puzzled about how to understand the English Reformation. And when I teach the English Reformation in Germany, and the German students are always being told, the Reformation is founded on justification by faith, students are always saying to me, but the English Reformation is not really a Reformation at all. So is it or isn't it? And one of the questions I found myself asking a couple of years ago was precisely that question of, actually, how was the English Reformation perceived at the time elsewhere? Now, so this next section is going to look a little bit at some of the things I found out about how Henry VIII's Reformation is being perceived in Wittenberg. And one of the intriguing things for me was I realised that nobody had actually written about this before. Nobody had asked the question, how is what's happening in England being perceived and understood in other parts of Europe? And that's quite intriguing because I think that is also something we continue to do. We continue not to wonder how what we're doing is being and thinking is being perceived elsewhere. So some key periods in the early period of the English Reformation. The fall of Cardinal Wolsey, Archbishop of York, who did he fall, was he pushed? Both. In September 1529, he surrenders his seal of office to the king, and in October 29, he pleads guilty to the charge of praemunire, which is the charge with which all English clergy were going to be charged, and praemunire is treason. It's the charge that all clergy, starting with the archbishops, were charged with having taken an oath to a foreign power. Because all clergy, then and now, take an oath of obedience. And they take an oath of obedience to their bishop, and the oath of obedience to the bishop in the late medieval church also implied, obviously, an oath of obedience up through the hierarchy of the church to the Bishop of Rome. So all clergy were taking an oath of obedience to the Bishop of Rome as the Pope. But of course the Pope was also the territorial ruler, of the political territorial ruler of a foreign territory. And so what Henry VIII does, very clever, is to charge all his clergy with having committed treason because they've sworn an oath of obedience to a foreign power. Now, we're not talking about the English Reformation today so much. We're talking about how was this seen in the German context. So Luther writes in February 1530, so about 4 months later, everywhere the ungodly, I'll just apologise in advance for Luther's intemperate language. It makes him really fun to read, but it can be a bit offensive, so I apologise. I apologise for those who are offended by his language. I'm just giving you what he said. So if we have any ungodly papists here, I'm very sorry. Everywhere the ungodly papists are caught in trouble. They don't repent. England is admitting the gospel while the king looks the other way. The cardinal, that's Wolsey, that demigod of England or even of Europe, has been sentenced to life imprisonment. And actually he died before he could be actually put into life imprisonment. So one of the things that's intriguing, we can see right from this period, is that Luther does actually know, is being told what's happening in England fairly quickly afterwards. And I have to say, we need to be aware in the background of this that Luther's relationship to Henry was, let's say, not good, because Luther had written a text saying in 1520, saying that there were only 2 sacraments and not 7. And in 1521, Henry VIII either himself writes or ghost writes, with his bishops actually writing, a text asserting the 7 sacraments. And it's that text which is praised by the Pope that gives Henry VIII the title Defender of the Faith, Defensor Fidei, which our monarchs carry to this day. Luther was furious with Henry VIII for having written with this text, the assertion of the 7 sacraments. He was furious with the Pope for having given Henry VIII the accolade of Defensor Fidei, and that is the background to what's going to come on. So Luther and Henry VIII, Luther does not approve of Henry VIII, and Henry VIII does not approve of Luther. So what happens when Henry VIII rejects the authority of the Pope? Well, in 1534, Melanchthon, who is Luther's friend and colleague in Wittenberg, writes to his friend Friedrich Myconius, the King of England has published articles against the Pope, defending his authority and summoning the Pope to a council. And one of the things that the reformers were trying to do was to persuade the Pope to have a proper council to discuss the matters of the Church. So Melanchthon knows this. I'm not clear, and one of the difficulties of doing this project is actually working out what text they're thinking about at this time. So I'm not clear exactly which articles these are, but this is written in the process, in the time when Henry is moving against the clergy. There's been a series of acts to control the clergy. The Act of Supremacy is not passed until the 3rd of November, but we're in the lead up to it. And in March 1st, 1535, Melanchthon writes to his great friend, close friend, Joachim Camerarius, Henry, who's now married Anne Boleyn, cares nothing about church matters, but no cruelty is being exercised against those who are zealous for better doctrine. Now, zealous for better doctrine means putting themselves out for the Reformation. So we can see that there is interest in what's going on. And in 1534, 1535, 1536, we have a series of events in France, particularly the Affaire de Placard, execution of numbers of Protestants. This is where John Calvin flees France the first time. And in 1535, in July, Thomas More is executed in England. Now, More, the great humanist, the friend of Erasmus, and the opponent of Protestantism. Melanchthon, again, himself a humanist, writing again to Joachim Camerarius in 1535, this year of 1535 has been fatal to our order. I hear that More has been put to death, and others, I'm in danger. The hatred shows itself partly in the French business. And I think here we have a reference to the Affaire de Placard. But again, Melanchthon knows and is disturbed by what's happening to Thomas More in England. Now, by 1535, Henry VIII is entering into negotiations with the Schmalkaldic League, which was the League of Protestant Territories in Germany, which had been established to stand against the League of Catholic Territories. And one of the things that the League is doing in this period is seeking to work out its theological basis. They've worked out, but to articulate its theological basis. And through the autumn of 1535 and the spring of 1536, Henry VIII sends an embassy of theologians to negotiate in Wittenberg to try and work out a theological agreement between the English, what's happening in England, and what's happening in Germany, or in the German territories, some of the German territories. Luther writes to Gregor Bruck, who is the Chancellor of the territory of Saxony within which he lives. The King, Henry VIII, is now offering to accept the gospel, to join the federation of our sovereigns, and to permit our apologia, that's the apology to the Augsburg Confession, to circulate in his kingdom. It seems to me that if His Majesty would be honourably received into the Federation, it would confound the Papists with regard to both to the Council, so the General Council, and all their other plans. And here we see Luther's own ambiguity about this. Since all of this is taken place by itself in this way, without our seeking it, God might actually intend something which is bigger and better than we're capable of understanding. Luther can't quite believe that this monster, Henry VIII, is actually coming to be on his side, or is he? And that's the big question that the Lutherans are asking over the next few years. So that's September 1535. By April 1536, Luther's a bit hesitant about what's actually going to happen and what's going to change in England. It's true, he says, that one must patiently realise that in England not everything can be abruptly put into practice according to the teaching of the gospel, just as amongst ourselves it didn't go swiftly. Nonetheless, the central points mustn't be changed or abandoned. It seems to me, he says, it's dangerous externally to make an alliance if the hearts are not united. In other words, if Henry VIII isn't going to sign up to the agreement, the theological agreement of the Schmalkald League, then actually he shouldn't be allowed to join. And he isn't, because he won't. Now, what's happened, what then happens, is the arrest of Anne Boleyn. The intrigue against Anne Boleyn happening pretty much as Luther is writing this letter. She's arrested on the 2nd of May. She's executed on the 19th of May, very quick. And by the end of May, Melanchthon is already writing about the execution of Anne Boleyn. The reports from England are more than tragic. The Queen is thrown into prison with her father, her brother, 2 bishops and others for adultery. And Luther also writing that monstrous tragedy in England, that is the execution of Anne Boleyn, who is known amongst reformers, though less known than I had expected, as being one of the supporters of the reform. Melanchthon, writing then 3 years later, in a period in which Henry VIII and his court are moving back towards more traditional religion, wants to try and encourage Cranmer and others to actually introduce the Reformation as it is understood in Wittenberg. Britain, and he uses the word Britain, Britannia, having stamped out the tyranny of the Bishop of Rome, should now, is the implication of this, cast out the abuses which from the Bishop of Rome have flowed into the churches. For how do these things accord? Do you retain the impious laws of Rome after having removed their author? Why not get rid of the poison as well? So we can see that by the late 1530s, there's considerable frustration in the German Wittenberg camp at seeing actually the English, yes, they've got rid of the papacy, but they're not doing anything else. They're not really getting on with having a Reformation. Melanchthon is aware, because at this period as well, there is also an embassy in England, that the Act of 6 Articles is being drafted. This is the Conservative Act, which reasserts transubstantiation, reasserts the celibacy of the clergy, reasserts auricular confession, and there's 3 others which I'm now not going to be able to just remember off the top of my head, but it's the Conservative Act reasserting the traditional practices which had probably been made slightly more flexible over the 1536. Melanchthon soon after very soon after the passing of the Act of 6 Articles, it's amazing how quickly information is being passed at this stage, and I would love to know the mechanics of that. Actually, how they knew within 2 weeks that Anne Boleyn had been executed. I would really like to know how they knew that, because I don't. In England, he says, the pious doctrine is again oppressed and our adversaries triumph. Some suspect that this is because of the deliberations for the marriage of the Emperor Charles with the King of England's daughter. So this was the discussion about whether Mary or Elizabeth would marry Charles V. I hear that many are put in danger, whom may God preserve. And indeed, Cromwell in 1540, 1541, 1540, over the whole affair of Anne of Cleves, is going to be arrested and executed. And Melanchthon, again, very quickly afterwards, just 2 weeks afterwards, is writing to a colleague in England, Cromwell, who had the highest influence with the king, has been hanged, drawn and quartered. They're actually wrong about that. He's actually executed. So they're wrong about how he was executed, but they're right about the fact that he was executed. The English tyrant, so we see the language about Henry VIII becoming more and more negative here, is contemplating other outrages of which you will hear shortly. And again, atrocious crimes are reported from England. The divorce with the Lady of Julia, that's Jülich, which is Cleves, so that's Anne of Cleves, is already made. And another woman married, that's Catherine Howard. Good men of our opinion in religion are murdered. Now, one of the interesting things about this correspondence is actually who are the good men of our opinion. So Thomas More, although he's not a Protestant, is one of us for Melanchthon. Here we're talking about Cromwell and others who are executed at this period. So what I want you to see really is that during this period of Henry VIII's reign, what is happening in England? Yes, there are questions about whether or not Luther influenced it. There's big questions about that. But what is happening in England is being followed with considerable interest else in Wittenberg. And I'm about to put in a research project grant application to try and do this, track this in a bit more detail, because I would be really interested to know who knows what about where. How are people actually finding out what's going on? This, for me, is evidence that the English Reformation was definitely being claimed, or was it? It was being explored in Wittenberg. They were asking questions about, is this a Reformation? Is this Protestantism? We could look at something similar for how what's happening in the Edwardian Church is being received. And what happens under Mary when Marian refugees, there's some really interesting correspondence, when Marian refugees flee to Frankfurt, and the Frankfurt people say, well, they can't come to our church services because they're not really Lutherans, which is right, they're Reformed. And Melanchthon writes to the Frankfurt City Council and says, but you should let them in, they're part of the Reformation movement. So this question about how do people belong, at what point does people start to be excluded because they didn't quite belong to the right church, actually looking internationally can help us to understand how people were relating to each other. And I don't know, but one of the questions as well for me is how is then the Elizabethan settlement being perceived? We do know that when James VI of Scotland became James I of England as well, he was seen in international circles as being a peacemaker. And Johannes Kepler, who in the early 17th century was writing about the harmony of the universe at a time when the universe was disintegrating around him, because the 30 Years' War was about to start, and politically, Central Europe is in total disintegration in the early 1600s. Johannes Kepler dedicates his work on the harmony of the world to James VI and I. as an exemplifier of somebody who is keeping peace between the religions. Now, I'm not sure that's how the Scots would have seen it, and we'll come back to that. But I think this question of how things are being perceived elsewhere is actually very illuminating. Now, Alec Ryrie has said the late 17th century English church was not only defined by its alignment with the kingdom of England, but also by its sense that it was ancient, pristine, and existed in splendid isolation, still reviling its old mother church in Rome, and now also despising its sister churches in Germany, Scotland, and elsewhere. Alec Ryrie would place the birth of English exceptionalism and the sense of England as an individual church very much in this 17th century post-Restoration period. So whereas McCulloch is arguing very strongly for an international understanding of the Reformation in the 16th century, both McCulloch and Ryrie would say things start to change in the 17th century. Maybe this is a period where science is thinking about atoms. Maybe it's also a period where politically, it's certainly a period where politically people are thinking more about national identity. So, as I said at the beginning, one of the questions, though, as we start to think about English exceptionalism, is it's easy to forget that other people also thought that they were exceptional. So how do we get at exceptionalism elsewhere? Sorry, that slide is out of order. This slide was meant to follow the Ryrie slide, I apologise. Mark Royce picks up those discussions of Ryrie, or he doesn't, but Royce and Ryrie are working on a kind of parallel trend here. One of the things Mark Royce has done, who's a historian of political ideas, an American historian of political ideas, is to look at, he's interested in how actual debates in the Brexit discussion find their roots in the language of the 17th, 16th and 17th century. Now, he will want to say that this is Reformation discourse. I'm a bit unhappy about using the terminology of Reformation discourse for people as late as Thomas Hobbes. But he wants to argue that what we see in some of the Brexit rhetoric is drawing on long traditions of rhetoric about how the English groups were thinking about themselves. So popery as a totalitarian ideology which must be rejected, definitely there in much Reformation rhetoric. Royce pinpoints it into John Fox's Book of Martyrs. Britain as a divine commonwealth, very much the language of Oliver Cromwell, thinking about the particular relationship between Britain and Britain as a commonwealth. Now that draws on language of covenanting relationships between God and the Scots, which are really important in the Scottish Reformation, and we'll come back to that in a minute. The monarch or the sovereignty of this country is inviolable, something that Royce would argue goes back to Thomas Hobbes. And the idea that Parliament is sovereign and can make the decisions in the country, he would place that as something emerging from the ideas of the Levellers. And the idea that people have liberty to decide, there in Milton, also there in John Locke, actually. So Royce wants to argue that that much of the rhetoric that we've seen in those arguing against Europe can be traced back, and in his article that's what he wants to do. Looks back at Ian Paisley, at Tony Bennett, Enoch Powell and Michael Foote in the 70s, and then more recent arguments, and traces the way that he would argue these theological arguments are actually shaping current Eurosceptic arguments. And his conclusion is that the champions of British, but actually most of that's English, but British Euroscepticism have been consistently informed by the theological teachings of the English Reformation. But here, so in a sense, Royce is taking us back to the English exceptionalism question. But one of the things, I live in Scotland, I teach in Scotland, I teach the Scottish Reformation, and one of the things that has struck me for a long time about the Scottish Reformation is that if much English Reformation historiography is focused on the idea that this is England over against Luther, Calvin and co., Scottish historiography of the Reformation is very much about saying the Scottish Reformation is rooted in the Reformation in Geneva. There's an international sense to how the Scottish Reformation understands itself. John Knox and the Genevan influence, which actually really, which is really important to part of Scottish identity, to the extent that I would claim, or that I would say that they claim Genevan influence on early Scottish reformers who cannot possibly have been influenced by Geneva because they were executed earlier than Calvin was writing things. So that's kind of, but so the genre of Scottish Reformation writing is very different from the genre of English Reformation writing in terms of how it sees itself as part of an international movement. Scotland has much more quickly seen itself as part of international Calvinism, part of an international movement. And of course in Scotland, sorry, that's, I'll just stop that, that's trying to back up, let's just cancel that. Of course in Scotland, the way that you kind of, the group you identify yourself against, if you're going to be Scottish exceptionalist, is often the English. And what we can see in Scottish Reformation historiography is some really interesting questions emerging about how different groups of Protestants understood themselves. So in 1618, James VI and First, who had been such a staunch Reformed Protestant when he got married to a Danish Lutheran, that the Danish Lutherans chose not to have any candles on the altar because they didn't want to offend James VI. As soon as James VI becomes James I of England and meets the Church of England, he actually starts to find ritual, and particularly bishops, rather useful things. And in 1618, the 5 Articles of Perth are passed by the General Assembly in Perth, which require Scots to do certain things which are part of the way that the Church of England is functioning. Now, I want to argue part of the underlying assumptions of this paper is that late 16th century English Church of England, a church in England, is actually pretty Protestant. And that's a different paper, but we can discuss that in the questions. So what these things that the church in Scotland is now being asked to do are perfectly acceptable to most Protestants in England. Not all Protestants, but most Protestants in England. Kneeling for communion, private baptisms allowed, not required, but allowed. Sick communion, possible. Episcopal confirmation of children aged 8, and the keeping of holy days such as Christmas and Easter. All of those things are written into the being of the church, the Protestant church in England, and indeed the being of many Protestant churches across Europe. In Scotland, they are rejected as papist practices. And with the Scottish Prayer Book under Charles I, if you were brought up with the same Charles History of England that I was brought up with, you will know all about Jenny Geddes picking up her stool and throwing it at the preacher in St Giles Cathedral to get rid of the Scottish Prayer Book. And the Scottish Book of Common Prayer, introduced in 1637 into Scotland under Archbishop Laud, is rejected as being papist. That leads into a considerable amount of revolutionary unrest. We're going to get into the National Covenant and then the Solemn Leave of Covenant. We're going to get into bishops' wars. It's really these questions about what kind of Protestant church and whether England and Scotland should have the same Protestant church that lead us into the Commonwealth, leads us into questions of civil war across Scotland and England and Wales and Ireland, indeed, in the 17th century. And it's not until 1688 or 1692, with the accession of William and Mary, that Presbyterianism will actually become firmly established in Scotland, leaving Scotland with a different religion from England. And the 1707 union establishes and confirms the true Protestant religion and the worship, discipline and government of this church, that is the Church of Scotland, without any alteration to the people in Scotland in all succeeding generations. So from the 18th century onwards, there is a constitutional acceptance that the religion of England and the religion of Scotland are going to be different. Now, what I want to suggest from that is, A, there's a complex relationship between the Scottish and the English churches, as there is between Scotland and England. I would want to ask a question about whether the Scottish Reformation experience, which is definitely perceived in the historiography as being more consciously international, whether it was actually more international than the English, or is it simply that the historiography has portrayed the Scottish Reformation as more international than the English? Now you can see where this is going, probably, because it's very easy to produce a very deterministic response to this. So if we now just turn to the referendum in 2016 and just look at some of the breakdowns. So we all know the overall, we all know that number, the 49%, or it depends where you put your decimal points, but the 51% who voted leave and the 49% who voted remain. What is really intriguing is if you look at male and female, 54% of men who voted leave, and 51% of women who voted remain. So actually, women, we could be saying, actually, women voted not to leave. You know, well, how does that make up divisions if you're going to say, well, you know, so if you're going to have a special situation for Ireland, should you have a special situation for all women? One of the things that, and I should say I put these statistics together to give a paper to a German context. So you may know some of this just back to, you know, just off by heart, but also you may think some of this is a bit simplistic, but actually some people I've talked to don't know it. So one of the reasons our Parliament then found itself so difficult, in such difficulties, because most MPs actually wanted Remain, but constituency by constituency, 263 parliamentary constituencies voted Leave and only 119 Remain. So that, I think, is one of the reasons why we find ourselves in such a constitutional mess, actually. And just to look at, and again, I'm sure you're aware of this, in Lincolnshire and the East Coast, Essex, Norfolk, those are the places where you tended to get your highest Leave votes. And the highest Remain votes were 95.9% in Gibraltar, then three voting areas in London, and then one in Northern Ireland. And one of the things about the Northern Ireland vote that's interesting is that people quite often don't break it down by constituency, but actually unionist constituencies tended to vote, or all voted Remain, all voted Leave, and everybody else in Northern Ireland, all the others voted Remain. So Northern Ireland is not as simple as people sometimes suggest it is. I'm sure you've seen the age constituency before, a much stronger, younger vote for Remain and a much stronger, older vote for Leave. Ethnicity is really intriguing, I think. White British, absolutely spot on, and this shows just what a majority white British is. 51 Leave and 49 Remain. Other ethnicities, very different indeed. So other white ethnicities, 66% Remain. And mixed, all other ethnicities actually voted Remain. I'm sure you may also have seen the higher education ones, or the educational statistics. The higher education, the more likely you were to vote Remain. You may not have seen the religious constituencies, which is the kind of the point of this, where I'm going to. Christians, 56% of those who self-identify as Christian voted Leave. 51% of those who identified as no religion voted Remain. And those who are believers but not Christian believers, 59% voted Remain. Now, if we break that down, and this is based on, all the rest of this was based on on the big European, on the big national polls. This is based on a YouGov work that's done by Lyndon Woodhead. The Church of England, you can see over 60% voted leave. So the yellow is leave and the blue is remain. It's very striking just how Presbyterian Church of Scotland, there was a small remain, whereas Scotland itself was much more strongly remain. It's very striking, but if we break this even further down, we may want to come back and discuss that. If you look at Church of England and then ask people whether or not they go to church, so people who say we're Church of England, but they may or may not go to church, okay? If people who say they're Church of England but don't attend church regularly voted leave much more strongly than people who say they're Church of England and do go to church. And I think that is really intriguing about the kind of cultural legacies of some of what I started with. However, I just want to say, I am going to say however in a minute. One of the intriguing things for me about that was how the churches positioned themselves, and this is a bit of a chicken and egg discussion, I think. The Church of England held a neutral position on the EU referendum, although the bishops in the House of Lords tended to argue pro-European positions in the lead-up to the referendum. But there was a very strong sense, and I think an awareness that where the people were and where the bishops were in two different places, and that was it has been, I think, a real problem for the bishops and for the church leadership in general. The Church of England was the Church of Scotland was entirely neutral on the Scottish independence referendum. It offered a space to have discussions, but it did not take a position. It took a very clear Remain position on the EU referendum and has had a pro-Europe decision in the General Assembly right back in the 80s, and has consistently held this position. So it would be very easy on the basis of what I've been talking about today to have a kind of deterministic understanding that says, well, actually, the Church of England has always thought of itself as something different, and we now find ourselves in a situation where we're living out the difference of Englishness. However, I would like to draw your attention to, and this is kind of the order I discovered these things in myself, I'd like to draw your attention also to the 1975 referendum results, because actually they're in the other way round. And I think one of the most intriguing questions that I don't think anybody's really got to grips with yet is why? What is it that changed? What is it that changed about how people thought about themselves? So that in 1975, everybody voted to stay in the European community as it was in those days in 1975. But England and Wales voted much more strongly to stay in than Scotland and Ireland did. And now it's the other way around. And what has changed? I think that's a really interesting question. I don't have an answer, but if we're going to discuss Brexit, that might be a really interesting question to think about. So what I would like you to take away from this is that historiography is actually is complicated, and because reality was complicated, people now look back at the English Reformation under Henry and say, was it really a Reformation? But at the time, Luther and Melanchthon were looking at the Reformation in England and saying, is that really a Reformation? But they were looking. And I think that's something else that we really want to hold on to. It's really important that we are aware that what was happening then, people were watching each other. What is happening now? People are watching each other. I live in Germany as well as here. I read German newspapers as well as British newspapers. That is very interesting. It's always interesting, but it's very interesting at the moment. I'd also want to argue that, and as McCulloch argued, this is not original, that England's ambiguous relationship to its European relationships have shaped its historiography. I do think it's the case that English historians are more likely to think about England as a kind of separate unit than Scottish historians are. like you to think about Scotland as a separate unit. And that is partly to do with our own histories and our own national understandings. Now, you may think that's fine, or you may think, is that something we need to think about? I think it would be a good idea if we spent a bit more time thinking in schools about how actually we fit together. And actually thinking historically about how we're rooted and related to each other. And a lot of the work I do is looking at English-German relationships ecclesiastically. I'm very intrigued by them, both in the 20th century and in the 16th century. I do want to say Reformation history can shed some light on the current events and debates. I don't think it can as it's been used, but I do think it's useful to go back and look at the historiography. You may have noticed as we were going through some of those letters, some frighteningly close words being written about the Schmalkaldic League that are now being written about the EU. And actually sometimes looking at things in history can help us to reflect in a different way on where we find ourselves today. And altogether, as I've just said, I think all of this would suggest to me that we need a better understanding of the history of our international relationships, because I think it's having a better understanding of how we got to where we are that will actually help us to move forward from where we are into the future, which is going to look like, however it's going to look, as we will find out in the next 10 days or so. So I'm not going to offer any major answers, but what I hope you've seen is that the use of the historiography in the Brexit debates points to a simplistic historiography. There is a simplistic historiography there. There are more interesting stories, I think, to be told, and those more interesting stories can actually help us understand where we are today. Thank you very much.